Watch where you're going, you stupid janitor. The words hit harder than the bump that barely registered. They shattered the quiet elegance of the Four Seasons Beverly Hills like a gunshot in a library. They sliced through the clinking of silverware, the soft jazz from the live band, the muted conversations of millionaires and power players. Everyone froze. Every eye turned. Every phone quietly tilted into record mode. Charles Drake, billionaire CEO of Drake Nova Technologies, didn't flinch. He adjusted his pant leg, annoyed that his $1,000 Italian shoes now bore a few drops of spilled water. Liam Evans stood motionless, a cleaning cloth still in his hand, his utility cart beside him. He didn't speak. He didn't make excuses. He didn't apologize. He didn't need to. What Charles Drake didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that Liam wasn't just any janitor working a night shift at a high-stakes investor dinner. He was Elliot Strauss's son, adopted at 9, graduated with a degree in architecture. A former draftsman, now moonlighting at a luxury hotel, not because he had to, but because he chose to observe, to learn, to expose. Charles didn't just insult a janitor. He insulted the most important person in the room. And he did it with cameras rolling and the future of his $35 billion deal hanging by a thread. This isn't just a story about ego. It's a story about dignity. One about power, prejudice, and the quiet strength of someone who's been overlooked too many times until tonight. Because what happens next will change everything. This isn't fiction. It's a cautionary tale wrapped in truth. And if you've ever been underestimated, belittled, or told your voice didn't matter, you'll want to stay for every word. And if you believe respect should never be optional, hit that like button so more people hear this. Because tonight, the janitor was royalty. And the man who thought he owned the room, he was about to be served the most expensive lesson of his life. Liam Evans was not born into comfort. He was born into resilience. At just 32 years old, he had lived through more than most people twice his age. His wife passed away 2 years ago. A car accident, sudden, senseless, the kind that doesn't knock. It barges in, steals everything, and leaves nothing behind but medical bills and a silence too big for their small apartment. And so, the day after the funeral, Liam became both father and mother to a 7-year-old girl with severe asthma. Her name was Maya. Her laugh could fill a stadium. Her medical needs were endless. But to Liam, she was everything. He had once been a promising architect, dreams of designing skylines and winning awards. But reality does not care about blueprints. Bills piled up. Rent came due. So he walked away from the drafting table and into the workforce. 2 jobs, 6 days a week, 1 overnight shift, all to keep Maya in a good school and ensure her breathing treatments never stopped. Liam never complained, never posted vague quotes about struggle, never asked for pity. He believed in doing the hard things quietly. The world did not need to hear his pain. It needed to see him work. His face was kind. Thoughtful eyes, a strong jaw, a quiet demeanor that hinted at strength even when his voice was soft. People often underestimated him. He let them. Let them think he was just another man with a mop. Let them think he was invisible, because sometimes invisibility is armor. His shift at the Four Seasons was not out of desperation. It was intentional. He had turned down easier jobs, quieter positions. But working the elite floor, where the world's most powerful men wined and dined behind crystal and gold, gave him something money could not, access, and more importantly, insight. Liam watched. He listened. He learned. He saw how power moved in silence. He saw how kindness was rare and how cruelty disguised as confidence was often applauded. But most of all, he learned that the people who are ignored the most often know the most. So when Charles Drake insulted him in front of a room full of kings, Liam did not flinch. Because kings do not react, they remember. And then when the moment is right, they rise. Charles Victor Drake did not believe in apologies. He believed in leverage, in dominance, in silence used like a weapon. The kind of silence that fills a room after someone makes a mistake, just long enough for them to feel the weight of your disapproval. That was his favorite kind of power. At 38, Charles had clawed his way to the top of the tech world. CEO of Drake Nova Technologies, a company that started in his college dorm and became a billion-dollar giant in less than a decade. Innovation, sure. But Charles didn't credit innovation. He credited control. He didn't build his empire by being liked. He built it by being feared. The man had a reputation. Ruthless in negotiations, unforgiving in boardrooms, the kind of leader who fired people not for failing, but for hesitating. To him, hesitation was the enemy of results and weakness, unacceptable. Inside the walls of Drake Nova, employees whispered his name like a storm warning. Some admired him. Most feared him, but all of them obeyed him. Charles believed business was war. And in war, you don't make friends. You make casualties. His public image was curated. Sharp suits, sharper language. He gave interviews about disruption and leaning into discomfort. But what he never said on camera was what he believed in private: people are tools. Tools are only useful if they work. So when he walked into the ballroom at the Four Seasons that night, Charles didn't see people. He saw chess pieces. Elliot Strauss, the billionaire investor from San Francisco, was the king he needed to impress. Everyone else, pawns, background noise, including the service staff, especially the service staff. Charles never made eye contact with the help. Never said thank you. Never paused to consider how someone pushing a cart might one day carry a vote or a voice or something much more dangerous. He was arrogant, but not stupid. He studied power moves. He knew how to read a contract like a poker hand. But what he never learned, what he never valued, was character. And on this night, that blind spot would cost him everything. Because the man he dismissed as background noise, he was the headline. And he was about to become the cautionary tale no one would forget. The ballroom shimmered like a scene from a dream. White linen draped over mahogany tables, candles flickering in crystal holders, and the quiet hum of a string quartet waving through the air like silk. It wasn't just another dinner. It was the dinner. The kind of event where billion-dollar futures were whispered over appetizers, where alliances were sealed with wine and broken with a smirk. The kind of room where one wrong word could shift markets or make someone vanish from the Forbes list by morning. Tonight's guest list was a gallery of power, venture capital legends, legacy media moguls, a U.S. senator or two hiding behind designer ties. But all attention centered on just one man, Elliot Strauss. Strauss wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. At 72, the German-born investor was a quiet storm in a world full of thunder. His capital firm, Strauss Holdings, had backed some of the most successful and ethical ventures in the past 20 years. But what made him dangerous wasn't his money. It was his silence. He spoke rarely, but when he did, people moved. And tonight, he was considering investing $35 billion into a full acquisition of Drake Nova Technologies. The buzz around the room wasn't about the food. It was about whether Charles Drake would close the deal. Liam Evans moved through the periphery of it all. Dressed in a crisp uniform, hair neatly combed, posture straight, he moved like background music, present, essential, but unnoticed. He knew the rhythm of the elite, knew when to clear a table, when to stay out of sight, which guests made eye contact, and which ones didn't. And he knew tonight was different. He could feel the tension in the air. It clung to his skin like humidity. He had memorized the event layout. He'd spent 2 days reviewing Strauss's preferences and Charles's known demands. He was prepared, but he hadn't prepared for what was about to happen. Charles Drake sat at table 1, his back straight, his confidence overflowing. Elliot sat across from him, calm, unreadable. Their entourages flanked them on either side, nodding at every word. Liam approached the area near the table with his utility cart, his step steady, his movements discreet. He leaned in to wipe a small smudge from the floor. And that's when the cart's wheel caught on the thick carpet, and the room changed. The water bottle didn't shatter. It didn't need to. It tipped slow, deliberate, as if guided by fate. Clean water spilled like a silent accusation across the polished floor, crawling toward the cuff of Charles Drake's $1,000 suit pants. A few drops landed on his custom Italian shoes. Liam reacted instantly. "I'm so sorry, sir," he said softly, already reaching for a cloth. It was instinct, reflex. Years of quiet service kicking in. But Charles Drake didn't see service. He saw an offense. And he didn't speak like a man addressing a mistake. He spoke like a king addressing a peasant who dared step on marble. "Watch where you're going, you stupid janitor." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The words were surgical, precise, cold, designed to cut through flesh and dignity alike. The entire table froze. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks hovered inches from mouths. The quartet in the corner let the final note hang in the air, unsure whether to continue or vanish into the wallpaper. Liam stood still, cloth in hand, eyes lowered. He had heard worse in the past. Quiet jabs, offhand comments. A joke whispered too loud when people thought he was just part of the furniture. But this was different. Because this time, the room had heard it too. Charles didn't apologize. He didn't even look at him. He motioned to a server for a new napkin as if swatting away a mosquito. One of his junior executives laughed under his breath, awkward, nervous, trying to pretend the moment wasn't radioactive. Liam didn't move, and that silence, that stillness, was louder than any shout. Across the table, Elliot Strauss set down his fork. He didn't speak, he didn't blink, but his gaze shifted to Charles with the weight of a gavel. Liam finally stepped back. "I'll clean that right away," he said, voice even, calm. Not a single note of anger, only something deeper, resolve. Around them, the room struggled to restart. Small talk resumed, but it was mechanical, forced. Phones buzzed quietly. Some recording, some sending messages. The damage was done, but not to Liam. The real crack, the one no one could hear, was beneath Charles Drake's feet. And by the time he realized it, he was already falling. Elliot Strauss didn't move. While others shifted in their seats, cleared their throats, and awkwardly adjusted their collars, he remained completely still. The kind of stillness that makes people uncomfortable. The kind that says, "I saw everything, and I don't forget." At 72, Elliot had seen men like Charles Drake his entire life. Different suits, different names, same arrogance. He had grown up in post-war Berlin, raised by a mother who had survived more than most would believe. She taught him the value of silence, not as weakness, but as strategy. When someone tells you who they are, she used to say, "Watch." They always show their truth when they think no one important is watching. Tonight, Charles had shown his truth. And unfortunately for him, someone important was watching. Liam had handled the moment with a grace beyond his years, his tone had been calm, his movements measured. But Elliot had noticed the tension in his shoulders, the pause behind his eyes, the way his breath caught for just a second longer than usual. He recognized that pause. He had lived that pause. It was the pause of someone deciding whether to break or to rise. And Liam had chosen to rise. He admired that. But more than admiration, he felt something else, confirmation. Liam had insisted on working this job himself. He had offered him comfort, a consulting position, a leadership role. He declined every one. He said he wanted to understand how American business really worked, not from a boardroom, but from the basement. Now he understood why. Charles Drake had just made the most expensive mistake of his career. Elliot leaned toward his assistant and whispered in German. "It's time." The assistant nodded and stepped away from the table, phone already in hand. Elliot didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to stand. Power doesn't shout. It watches. And when the moment is right, it moves. Charles, still oblivious, resumed talking, laughing too loudly, trying to brush the moment under the velvet rug of high society. But Elliot wasn't brushing anything away. He was writing it down in memory, in principle, and soon, in action. Because when character is tested in public, consequences should follow in public, too. And Elliot Strauss had just made up his mind. The courses kept coming, but the appetite was gone. Steaks arrived on plates hot enough to steam. Delicate sauces drizzled like art. Glasses refilled automatically, wine flowing like it was still a celebration. But no one at table 1 was celebrating anymore. Elliot Strauss sat with his hands folded, his knife untouched, his eyes heavy with silence. Charles Drake, meanwhile, kept trying to recover the room with shallow confidence and louder than usual laughter. He leaned into his pitch, speaking fast, speaking hard. "You know what separates winners from whiners?" he asked, his voice slicing through the table like a poorly timed toast. "Winners get over distractions. They focus. They dominate." His executives nodded too quickly, the kind of nods that say, "Please just move past this." Elliot didn't nod. He just picked up his water glass, took a single sip, and set it back down without breaking eye contact. Liam returned to the area with quiet precision. He had a dry cloth and a dustpan to ensure the floor was completely safe. He served the room with his silence, moving with poise even when the air around him felt like a storm gathering. He offered a soft smile to the elderly couple at the next table. He picked up a crayon that had fallen to the floor and handed it gently back to a child nearby. This wasn't just service. This was grace under pressure. And Charles Drake, for all his power, couldn't recognize it. He only saw someone beneath him. Someone to be corrected, dismissed, ignored. "Let's talk numbers, Mr. Strauss," Charles said suddenly, trying to pivot the moment. 35 billion. Full integration within 2 quarters. We'll double your ROI in under 18 months. Elliot tilted his hand. "Before we discuss numbers," he said calmly, "I prefer to observe values." A chill moved through the table, because in that sentence, Elliot made it clear. This dinner wasn't about contracts anymore. It was about character. And Charles Drake had just failed the first course. It was supposed to be routine. Liam approached the table again, this time to finish cleaning the small spill. The tension in the room had shifted. No longer sharp, but dense, heavy. The kind of atmosphere that settles over a room when people pretend nothing happened, but everyone remembers everything. He moved with practiced ease, kneeling to wipe the last of the water from the floor, no wasted motion, no misplaced emotion. He had cleaned hundreds of floors like this, around dozens of men like Charles Drake. But this wasn't just another dinner. As he knelt at the far end of the table, Charles's end, a hand shot out. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He just clamped down on Liam's shoulder, his grip tight. Not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to send a message. "You wait until I finish speaking," he hissed, his voice low, his breath thick with wine. "When real business is happening, you disappear. You make yourself invisible, like the help is supposed to." His grip lingered. The room didn't stop this time. No one gasped. No one dropped a fork, but eyes turned. People noticed. Liam met his stare. Calm, controlled, not shaken, not small. "Yes, sir," he said quietly, his tone neutral, but unbreakable. "I understand completely." Then, gently, without force, he stood up, forcing Charles to release his grip and step back. Charles blinked, as if surprised he hadn't flinched, as if disappointed that his intimidation didn't land. But Liam didn't retreat. He simply returned to his cart, his movements as smooth as ever, his dignity intact, his voice silent, but louder than anything else in the room. Elliot Strauss placed his silverware down again. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned to his assistant and said just 2 words in German. "It's time." The assistant nodded, stood, and disappeared through the side door. Charles went on talking, still trying to sell himself like nothing had shifted. But something had, and everyone at the table knew it. Because it wasn't just about spilled water anymore. It wasn't even about the insult. It was about the repeat offense. The kind of offense that says, "This isn't a mistake. This is who I am, and now that truth was no longer whispered. It was witnessed. And consequences were no longer a matter of if. Only when. Charles was still talking when Elliot Strauss rose from his seat. He didn't make a speech. Not at first. He simply stood slowly, quietly, like a storm gathering weight before thunder. His movement alone was enough to silence the table. The room followed his lead. Conversations faded. Silverware paused mid-air. Even the waitstaff along the wall seemed to freeze, sensing that something irreversible was about to unfold. Elliot looked at Liam. He met his eyes, steady, calm, unreadable. Then with a nod that felt both like permission and acknowledgement, he turned back to the table. "Mr. Drake," Elliot said, his voice even, almost gentle. "Before we move forward, there is someone very important I'd like you to meet properly." Charles frowned, confused. "Of course," he said, forcing a smile. "Are you referring to one of your VPs? Or your general counsel?" Elliot didn't answer him directly. He raised one hand instead, gesturing toward the edge of the room. From the far wall, Liam stepped forward, no cart in hand, no longer in his work uniform, just the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to hide and everything to reveal. He stopped beside Elliot. Not behind him. Beside him. "This," Elliot said, resting a hand gently on his shoulder, "is Liam Evans, my son." The air cracked like glass under pressure. He was adopted when he was 9. He chose to keep his birth name, but make no mistake, he is my son, and I am every bit his father. Charles blinked once. Then again. His lips parted, but no words came. "Liam has been working here," Elliot continued, "not because he needed the income, but because he wanted to understand firsthand how people in power treat those they think are beneath them." Elliot turned slightly, facing the rest of the room. "And tonight, you all witnessed exactly that." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. A quiet murmur rippled through the guests. Phones tilted higher. Eyes widened. The silence was thick with realization. Liam stood tall, his chin lifted. Not triumphant, just truthful. Just seen. Elliot looked at Charles one last time. "The man you called stupid is the man I raised to be wiser than most CEOs I've ever met." And in that moment, the deal wasn't just in jeopardy. It was already dead. The sound of a chair scraping back shouldn't feel like an earthquake. But tonight it did. Elliot Strauss returned to his seat without another word. The room was still. Charles Drake remained frozen, his forced smile now cracked, his confidence drained from his face like color from a dying light. Then it started. One guest pushed back their chair and stood up. Then another, and another. A ripple of movement spread across the room. Quiet but undeniable. Phones vibrated. Notifications lit up screens. Some guests began checking their investment apps. Others simply walked out. The Strauss acquisition was unofficially dead, but publicly understood. And Charles Drake was still standing there, not realizing his empire had just lost its foundation. Elliot's assistant returned, whispering something into his ear. He nodded once. That was all it took. Less than 15 minutes later, headlines began hitting financial news outlets. Strauss pulls out of Drake Nova deal after public incident. Billion-dollar tech CEO faces backlash over classist comment. Investor's son called the stupid by Drake, deal terminated on the spot. By the time dessert was served, though no one touched it, Drake Nova stock had already begun to plummet. 17% down in less than an hour. Then 22%. Panic calls flooded Charles's phone. Board members, legal advisors, PR representatives, investors demanding statements, demanding explanations, demanding someone else in charge. But there was no spin big enough to bury what the world had just seen and what had just gone viral. The moment was now a trending video. Shared, clipped, reposted. Memes followed. Headlines intensified. Screenshots spread like fire in dry brush. Within hours, sponsors were pulling contracts. Strategic partners were issuing statements of deep concern. Talent at Drake Nova began resigning in waves. The company Charles built was unraveling. Not from poor strategy, not from bad tech, but from the rot at its core finally being dragged into the light. Arrogance had a price. And tonight, it was $35 billion, plus the collapse of everything Charles thought he controlled. At 11:47 p.m., the board voted to suspend him. At 12:14 a.m., his access to company servers was revoked. By sunrise, Drake Nova wasn't a powerhouse anymore. It was a headline in the business section under a single word: fallout. The sun hadn't even cleared the skyline when Liam Evans stepped into the Strauss Holdings headquarters. No longer in uniform, no cart in hand, no badge that read service staff, he wore a tailored blazer, charcoal grey with soft shoulders, and shoes that meant business, not burden. He wasn't just walking into a new building. He was walking into the next chapter of his life. Waiting for him in the executive wing was a new nameplate. Simple, sleek, professional. Liam Evans, Director of Corporate Humanity. The title wasn't decorative. It wasn't a symbolic gesture meant to smooth over headlines or calm investors. It was real. Created at Elliott Strauss's insistence, funded with full decision-making authority, and given to a man who had seen the best and worst of leadership from the ground floor. He sat at his desk for the first time with a steady breath, letting it all settle in. The calls, the chaos, the collapse, but also his choice, his voice, his place. Not given, earned. Later that afternoon, he stood at a company-wide live stream. Employees from San Francisco to Singapore tuned in. Some had only seen his face through viral clips. Others had worked alongside him, never knowing who he truly was. Now they would. He stepped to the mic. Yesterday, he began, I was called stupid. Not because I made a mistake, but because someone believed their title made them more human than me. A pause. I said nothing in that moment. But today, I choose to speak. The room, virtual and physical, was silent. There's a difference between power and leadership. One is taken, the other is earned. I didn't take this seat. I was trusted with it. And I intend to honor that trust. His voice remained calm. No anger, no revenge, just truth. I believe in companies where people are valued not just for what they produce, but for who they are. I believe every role deserves dignity, every title deserves accountability, and every voice, especially the quiet ones, deserves to be heard. Applause filled the room. Not polite, not corporate. Real. Because in Liam, they didn't just see a new leader. They saw a mirror, and finally, a future. What happened that night in the ballroom wasn't just about one CEO and one janitor. It was about all of us. It was about how we treat people when we think no one's watching. How easy it is to value resumes over respect, titles over truth, and power over people. But here's the thing, someone is always watching. And not just with a camera. Sometimes it's a child at the next table. Sometimes it's a colleague at the edge of the room. Sometimes it's the very person you think has no voice, no name, no consequence. That night, Charles Drake didn't lose a deal because of numbers or strategy. He lost it because he failed the simplest test of character, treating another human being with basic dignity. We all face that test every day. At the drive-thru, in a meeting, on the phone with customer service, in the elevator with someone we think can't help our career. Those are the moments that define us, not just as professionals, but as people. And Liam, he reminded us of something we forget far too often. That strength can be quiet. That dignity isn't given, it's lived. That real leadership isn't about who talks the loudest. It's about who listens the most. So maybe the next time we feel the urge to dismiss someone, to look past them, to say something small but cutting, we pause. And we ask ourselves one question: if that person turned out to be the one holding the pen over our future, would we be proud of how we treated them? Because sometimes the most powerful people in the room are not the ones at the head of the table. Sometimes, they're the ones cleaning it. And if you believe that too, if you believe dignity should never be optional and that every person has value, then share this story. Let someone else hear it. Let them remember that being decent isn't extra credit. It's the baseline. Because in the end, how we treat people is the real legacy we leave behind. And it starts with you and me right now.